Orin Thompson, age 75, a resident of Fond du Lac, died Thursday, October 19th, 2017. David was born on June 27th, 1942 in Manitowoc, son of the late Orin Thompson and Helen Lauderdale Thompson. He graduated from Valdez High School and the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh with a career in teaching. David had a passion for history, reading, and antiques, and genealogy. He is survived by his brother John of Madison, his sister Marilyn of Minneapolis, and nephews and nieces John C. Thompson, Kristen Thompson Corwin, Katherine Thompson Colbert, David Thompson Armus, and Nathan Thompson Armus. He was preceded in death by his parents and his brother, Paul Thompson.
Lo, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is thy victory? O death, where is thy sting? But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ.
He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn. They will be comforted. Blessed are the meek. They will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for rightness or righteousness. They will be satisfied. Blessed are those who show merciful. They will who show mercy. They will obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart. They will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers. They'll be called children of God."
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
He makes me lie down in
green pastures.
He leads me beside still waters.
He restores my soul.
He leads me in paths of righteousness.
For his name's sake.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
I will fear no evil, for you are with me.
Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
You prepare a table before me.
In the presence of my enemies.
You anoint my head with oil.
My cup overflows.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me
all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
David has had an extraordinary life with exceptionally challenging last 7 years. I know mostly only what I've heard about the years preceding his illness. He was a private, proud, brilliant, in ways complicated man. So without intruding too much on his privacy, I want to talk about what I know of these years. I think I was the principal woman in David's life during these 7 years. That's not to say there weren't many other women vying for that position, but I can fairly say that it came to me to see that he was clothed, supplied with Diet Coke at first, and later Diet Pepsi when he learned it was cheaper, that he attended the better movies, at least the top Academy Award winners, wherever they could be found. We saw Les Miserables and Appleton. and that he was able to break his puree diet restrictions with popcorn and fried chicken from time to time. One of the worst and most difficult side effects of David's condition was the dysphagia, or swallowing disorder, which caused much of the cola and popcorn in particular to find their way into his lungs. I had competition in helping David break his eating rules from his particularly special friend Brenda, who helped in countless ways to the very last, but also brought him colas and candy. Brother John found goodbyes in pub mix at Costco, a favorite for us all, but high on the list of forbidden foods. You might think that as a nursing home resident, David's life was uneventful. That is not entirely true. It is the case that he presented a major challenge to the recreational therapists in the home, whose task it was to find something interesting to occupy his time. He was entirely resistant to playing bingo, cards, singing along with the group, attending the annual summer and fall picnics, or watching the communal TV. He was unreceptive or unable to utilize the bedside radio, bedside telephone, an iPod full of his favorite music, or an iPad having icons which included eBay, his favorite shopping site. David was disinterested or unable to read books either on tape or in hand for years. He appreciated some public television shows and series, taking up an hour or so of his Sunday nights. He thoroughly and regularly read his weekly Time magazines, the Fond du Lac Reporter, and the Valdez Journal. And there were some very important regular friends and visitors who helped fill his days. They kept him supplied with the important antique auction schedules and the baseball caps he wore at all times. David made clear that he appreciated my visits and calls, though as a stoic Norwegian, the information was not conveyed directly as in, "Thank you very much for coming, it means a lot to me." Rather, he would say, "Did you have a good time?" or "When will you be back exactly?" He looked forward to the escape that these visits afforded and would say, "Let's go," almost immediately after I arrived. I would fling him and wheelchair into my car and we would head for random destinations. Characteristic of David was the fact that he could not decide where he wanted to go, but that he always knew exactly how to get there. Over the years, we scouted out the best ice cream cone in a 30-mile radius, which we concluded was Kelly's Farm, though a close second was the cones at the antique store near Green Lake. We explored the flea market and outlet stores in Oshkosh and stopped for a haircut at a barber shop there. We frequented LeClaire Farms near Pike to check out the baby goats, to have a gourmet lunch, which David never liked, and to enjoy their exceptional flower garden. Appleton seemed to have the closest full bookstore in the area, so after perusing there, we went to Highcliffe State Park, a place we had visited with our parents as children. We drove to a friend's newly restored cottage on Lake Michigan, where the uneven ground made David's wheelchair flip and had him on his back looking at the sky. When Sharon and I were planning a bathroom redo, David, John, and I were off to shop at the Kohler Design Store. Though these adventures were often challenging, they provided us with fun, lots of conversation, and things for him to ponder when back in the nursing home. Unable to move around independently, even in the immediate vicinity of his bed. We had some particularly memorable outings as well. As children, our family vacationed during summers exclusively at Grandma's house near Lauderdale Lakes. This is where we all became people who preferred to be by quiet lakes as opposed to those who prefer mountains and oceans. Grandma owned a two-story, turn of the last century, totally wheelchair inaccessible cottage. It had been the site of many important gatherings before my generation, including our parents' wedding party. Though that was home to us, it now belonged to someone else. Brother John came to own the matching cottage next door. We packed David up for a weekend at the cottage and with tremendous effort managed to get him in his wheelchair down the hill and into the building, but he could barely be moved through the doors from room to room. It was with great effort and finesse that he was transferred to the waist-high antique bed. In the middle of one night, soon after I had checked on him and returned to my second floor bed, John heard him cry out and in turn cried out to me. David was on the floor next to that bed, having no idea how he had gotten there and not terribly concerned. It was a major job to hoist him back to bed. We spent holidays as possible with him. On one occasion, we celebrated at the Osthoff Resort in Elkhart Lake. Having success with that, we decided to repeat the same a couple years later. This time, a blizzard ensued. Sharon and our kids altered reservations to stay in Fond du Lac while John and Jane were comfortably in place at the Osthoff. We knew that we couldn't transport David to Elkhart Lake, and determined to go through with a holiday celebration, we worked at getting a non-ambulatory David into and out of the car despite icy ground, strong sideways winds, biting snow, and near blinding visibility. I remember the nursing home administrator walking by heading home for the day and offering to help us while no doubt wondering the wisdom of our plans. We had dinner at a supper club in town and had the entire restaurant to ourselves, being the only crazy people to have ventured out in such weather. Of note, I think, is that in 7 years of my transferring David in and out of my car hundreds of times, there was never a fall. Incidentally, despite his micrographia, or tiny, really illegible handwriting due to his disease, David, with the help of Brenda, never missed sending his holiday cards in those years. I want it to be known that David had many passions and interests in his life. You may have heard the music behind the photo collections, or will later, of David. He introduced me to opera and gifted me a collection of Maria Callas' arias, a historic collection, from which that music was chosen and was among his favorites. He loved antiques more than anything and spent much of his lifetime picking and selecting special items of furniture, porcelain, and silver, always getting the best deal. He never tired of looking through Antiques Digest, Architectural Digest, and antique sales circulars to the end. David was the kid in our family who listened to the stories relayed by our grandparents, parents, and other relatives about our ancestors, their lives and origins. In a time when there was no internet, information was gathered by sleuthing through letters, exchanged with libraries, distant relatives, and through cemetery records. He spent hours, days, years working to discover extraordinary details about his mother and father's families, going back centuries into the old countries. With this interest, he formed connections and friendships with distant relatives across the country. One of his greatest worries in recent times was that his years of work would be lost with his passing. Though I have tried to absorb and learn his memory, his memory for these things was unequaled, and I know I will despair his loss the next time I try to recall a historical family detail or to identify someone on a family photo. The horrible neurological disease chipped away at David's phenomenal memory. Puzzling and extraordinary, it seems to me, was an aspect of this condition that I would describe as lack of insight. It might be best explained as a phenomenon where David was unaware or unable to recall moment to moment that he could not walk, even though it had been years since he had done so. And he was never able to understand how, when he swallowed a liquid or solid, it could possibly cause the subsequent coughing fit due to it going down the wrong way. So it was for 7 years. At the same time, David never forgot the day or date of a scheduled visit from John or me. He always would remind me not to forget to place the handicap parking card on the window or mirror when we parked in a handicapped spot. He always introduced me to the people he shared a dining table with, or the people who cared for him, by giving me their name and often a few descriptive details, like their hometown or the school they went to. Most important, through trial and error, despite his apparent inability or disinterest early on, David finally regained his love of reading. In the last 2 years of David's life, he read biographies of historical figures and other historical books, especially early American, some involving 700 pages of small print. I think he read more than a college student would have over the same period of time. He read this kind of book every week or two, and then shared details with me in a sort of book club by phone. He was insatiable, and it took great effort to find sufficient books to feed this appetite. The books provided, I think, a way of taking a trip away from where he was, surrounded by incommunicative and sometimes confused people, whenever he wished. He would pore over footnotes and bibliographies and then would request that I search for and acquire primary sources. Finding David books was not as simple as going to a bookstore, but I had to satisfy his frugal nature by finding the cheapest and least expensive copies. His last request was that I obtain a copy of a book published in 1966 by a French author called The Art of the Hermitage, or as he described it, a book of Katherine the Great's art. Needless to say, I have a lot of reading to do. 7 years older and nearly from a different generation than me for most of our lives, David and I were not close. He was a private man who did not share his world with me, nor did he appear to have much interest in my life. His disease, horrible beyond description, stripped away defenses and threw us together in intimate ways. This allowed us to get to know, understand, and appreciate each other in a rich way. For this I am eternally grateful. I will miss David as an important part of my life.
My name is Mark Thompson, and I'm the third cousin of John and Marilyn and David. David, John, and Marilyn and I all share the same great-great-grandfather and grandmother, so we are related in that way. My father, for those of you who are Valders people, my father was Conrad Thompson, and my grandfather and grandmother were Elmer and Aletta Thompson. For those of you who are Valders people, you would know those names. David Thompson was a genealogist, one who knew his family history, and what he discovered is an amazing story. We are sitting here at Faith Lutheran Church in Valders, Wisconsin, because of David Thompson's great-great-grandparents. Thomas Olson Helly and his wife, Kari Hoyme, came to America in 1948. After landing at Port Washington, and after a time of adjustment, Thomas and Kari came north to the Valders area. They purchased land 1 mile south and 1 mile east of Valders at the cost of, get this, $1.25 an acre. They began to build their first house on this property. The first night they slept in the house, they woke up the next morning with a few inches of snow all over the house, because one side of the house only had a tarp on it, and the snow blew in great quantities. Thomas was here because of his brother, Stephen Olson Helly, who had come many years earlier to the Valders area and returned a number of times to Norway to encourage more people to come to America. Norway was a beautiful place to live, but I've been on the Helly farm in Norway, and there is not much there to earn a living. And if you were not the oldest son in the family, you had to go out and look for a place to live and a way to earn your living. It was hard going. In 1852, Stephen Helly, David's great-great-granduncle, was bringing nearly 200 people over from Norway. As they sailed on Lake Erie towards the Erie Canal near Buffalo, New York, the captain of their ship and the captain of another ship, who were fierce enemies and hated each other, navigated their ships to collide with each other, causing hundreds of people to be thrown into the water, many of whom drowned. David's great-great-great-grandmother, whose name was Marit, and Stephen Helly and his fiancée were holding on to a board for dear life, but the board was not able to sustain all of them. David's great-great-great-grandmother, Marit, knew what she had to do, though she was just 71. Of course, no one could swim. She let go of the board and plunged into the deep water, allowing Stephen and his fiancée to live. Stephen and Brother Thomas and a host of others wanted to build a church in Valdez. Their faith was important to them, and they longed to worship together as a community. But where to build this church? Finally, 2 sites were offered. One closer to Thomas Helly, and one closer to Ole Gigstad. They decided to have a tree cutting contest to see who the winner would be. Unfortunately, David's great-great-grandfather was not the winner, and the church was built next to Ole Gigstad's farm. This church was one of the churches that eventually became Faith Lutheran Church, the church we are sitting in today. These Norwegian Americans had such a strong faith in God, and they knew that their whole existence depended on their God. When you walk through the cemetery in a few minutes, you will not see the gravestones of Thomas and Kari. They are buried in the West Church Cemetery. But look around you and see the saints who have gone before us. Look and see the names of those who gave their lives so their ancestors could know freedom and faith in America. By the way, Thomas and Kari Olsen Helly's youngest daughter, Siri, eventually married Ole Gigstad. And so when Thomas and Kari went to church, they could just walk across the road for lunch afterwards. It all worked out in the end. Well, David loved to hear stories like these. In fact, he would have probably been able to tell the stories much better than I, and with even more detail. And he had many stories to tell from his mother's side of the family as well. And why does a genealogist do what a genealogist does? Well, David probably had many reasons, but he may have been driven by a love of his family history, by a knowledge of historical facts, and maybe even by a desire to find out more about himself by knowing his family roots. I hope he was inspired as he did his research. When I read about the faith of Thomas and Kari, I am inspired. They were willing to risk their lives in sod houses with inches of snow in them, willing to risk ships that plunged beneath the seas, willing to leave behind parents, siblings, other family to get a new start in a new country. When I hear about the love that David's parents, Orin and Helen Thompson, had for this church, I am inspired. I am inspired when I remember the influence that the church had on my father and his family. Back in the 1930s, my dad's brother grew very sick with appendicitis. There was no penicillin in those days, and his future was bleak. My dad came to say goodbye to him on the night before he died, And he remembers Pastor Fredheim, pastor of this church, kneeling in prayer. He heard later that Pastor Fredheim stayed at the hospital all night long, praying for the soul of my dad's brother. My dad was so inspired that he decided that he also would go into the ministry so he could serve God's people as Pastor Fredheim did many years ago in Valders, Wisconsin. I was sitting where you are sitting now when I heard Dad tell that story to the congregation on this church's 150th anniversary. I can still remember hearing the emotion in his voice, even though his brother had died nearly 70 years before. Listen to me, please. Knowing our history, our genealogy, can inspire us and help us to know that God has been with our ancestors and with us through it all. And maybe, just maybe, David knew that too. Oh, and a brief aside, my dad loved to tell this story. Pastor Fredheim was a very animated preacher, and when he got in front of the congregation, he would just let loose. He was so excited about what he was going to say, so excited. Well, he also had false teeth. And one time he was preaching and he was so animated, and those false teeth leaped out of his mouth. He snatched them and put them back in his mouth and continued on with the sermon. So, lots of stories, and I'm sure, again, David could tell these stories better than I. But wonderful stories to remember. I was thankful when I heard this past week that David belonged to a Friday night club, as I've nicknamed it. There were a group of his friends who went out most every Friday night, and sometimes on other days and nights as well, and they hung out together. I happened by a McDonald's this past week, and there at the same table where they always sit was a group of people that I had seen many times before. I don't know if they met weekly or daily, but I know that they are often there when I visit this particular McDonald's. I try and sit close to them when I'm there because I'm curious about what they're talking about, what they're saying. Usually it's politics or football or the local gossip, nothing major, but I think it's wonderful that people can be together like that and have a community that cares for each other. I'm fortunate because I belong to a Sunday morning club. I belong to a church with some incredible friends, and we love to gather together for a church service and sometimes a brunch afterwards. These folks in this church challenge my faith, my priorities, my interests. Unfortunately, research is showing that fewer and fewer people have any kind of a group that they're a part of. I would encourage you to think about joining a Sunday morning club, or a Saturday club, or a Friday night club, or whatever, where you can hear the good news of God and feel the love that comes from others with like interests and with like faith. I discovered too this past week that David had some regrets. He told Sister Marilyn recently that he wished he had traveled more, and she guessed that he would have loved to have gone to the ancestors' homes and communities. He would have loved to have seen where his family came from and to see the results of the genealogy firsthand. Regrets. At every funeral, there are regrets. Are you regretting anything today? Maybe you've been thinking, I regret I didn't visit David more often. I wish I'd been more honest with him. I regret I didn't connect with him on a deeper level. I regret David could not be more honest with me. I regret that David did not thank enough, show appreciation enough, apologize more, or ask for forgiveness for the times he hurt us. Did David have those personal regrets? Did he ever wish he could turn back the clock and lead a different kind of life? Did David ever long to clear the deck and reveal why he did what he did and believe what he believed? We'll never know now. We know we were not perfect in our response to David. And we know that he was not perfect in his dealings with us. But we did what we could. Now it's time to clear the slate and move on. It's time to make other relationships more honest and more real. We'll never know what other regrets David had, but we can do something about our regrets. We can respond to God's forgiveness by being more forgiving. We can respond to God's love with our own love. We can respond to God's presence by bringing God into all aspects of our lives. We can bring God's message into our communities and speak out boldly. We can allow God's love to flow over us and in us and cleanse us of all our regrets. I believe in a God who forgives us in the times when we are not perfect. I believe in a God who loves us even when we don't love others. I believe in a God who can give peace to minds that are filled with resentment or anger or regret. I believe in a God who inspires me to be more than I could ever be all by myself. At the time of any death, there are so many feelings, so many memories, so many longings. It is my prayer that each of you will know the peace that God can give to you and share that peace with others. And it is my deepest prayer today that David Thompson knew that peace at the end of his life. It was around 75 years ago when David Orin Thompson was brought to our Savior's Church, the predecessor of this church, for baptism. His parents offered him to God, and God said, "This is my child. I will love him forever." Now today we bring David back one more time, and we offer him to God. And God says, "This is my child, and I will love him forever." And now I would ask you to say the benediction to David together, if you would please. It's in your bulletin. And as you're holding the bulletin with one hand, you could hold out your other hand towards David here. And read along with me, please. And now, David, as you go on your way, may God go with you. May he go before you to show you the way. May he go behind you to encourage you, beside you to befriend you, above you to watch over you, and within you to give you